In the spring of 2023, a team of archaeologists working in southeastern Turkey made a discovery that would fundamentally challenge everything we think we know about human history. They were not looking for anything extraordinary that day, just routine excavation work at a site that had already given up dozens of secrets over the previous 2 decades. But what they found in the deepest layer of excavation was not another carved pillar or ancient tool. It was evidence of something far more disturbing. They found proof that our ancestors deliberately buried their gods. Not figuratively, literally. Someone, 12,000 years ago, took an entire temple complex, covered it with dirt and rubble, and sealed it away from the world. This was not destruction by invaders, not the slow decay of time, not the result of natural disaster. This was intentional, systematic, ritualistic, and here is what makes it absolutely terrifying. This was not an isolated incident. The site is called Göbekli Tepe, and it should not exist. According to every textbook, every academic timeline, every established narrative about human civilization, the people who built this place were supposed to be simple hunter-gatherers. They had no cities, no agriculture, no written language, and yet somehow they constructed megalithic stone pillars weighing up to 20 tons, carved with intricate reliefs of animals and symbols we still cannot fully decipher, arranged in circular formations that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of astronomy and engineering. But that is not the mystery. The real mystery is why they buried it. Analysis of the soil layers shows this was not gradual abandonment. Someone filled in the entire complex with thousands of tons of earth and stone in what must have been a massive, coordinated effort. The kind of effort that requires organization, planning, and a very specific purpose. And when archaeologists examined the buried structures, they found something even stranger. Many of the carved figures had been deliberately defaced before burial. Eyes chiseled out, faces destroyed, sacred symbols obliterated. Someone wanted to erase these images from existence. Someone wanted to make absolutely certain that whatever these carvings represented would be forgotten. Now, you might think this is just one strange archaeological anomaly, an outlier, but here is where this gets genuinely disturbing. Göbekli Tepe is not alone. In the last 15 years, archaeologists have identified over 40 sites across the ancient world, showing the exact same pattern: different continents, different cultures, same time period, same evidence of deliberate, ritualistic erasure. In Turkey, at a site called Çatalhöyük, an entire settlement was suddenly abandoned around 8000 BC, with religious imagery systematically destroyed before departure. In Egypt, there is a mysterious gap in the religious record during the pre-dynastic period, where earlier forms of worship simply vanish from the archaeological evidence. In Peru, pre-Incan temple complexes show signs of intentional desecration and burial. In Malta, ancient underground structures were sealed and hidden. All of this happened within a 1500-year window, between 9500 and 8000 BC. All of it shows the same characteristics: deliberate destruction, systematic burial, targeted erasure of religious imagery. This was not random, this was coordinated, and it happened across the entire planet. So let me ask you the question that changed everything for me when I first encountered this evidence. What could possibly make our ancestors so terrified of their own gods that they would go to such extreme lengths to erase every trace of them from human memory? What did they know that we have forgotten? Hey everyone, this is Mr. H, and if this is your first time here, welcome to the channel where we dig into the mysteries that history tried to bury. If you are enjoying this already, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because what we are about to uncover goes deeper than you can possibly imagine. And for those of you who have been with me on this journey, you know we do not stop at surface-level explanations. We go where the evidence leads, no matter how uncomfortable that makes the mainstream narrative. Alright, let us keep going, because here is what makes this even more unsettling. When you examine the iconography that was destroyed, when you look at what they were trying to erase, you start to see a pattern. These were not images of abstract concepts or nature spirits. These were depictions of specific entities, beings described across multiple ancient cultures with remarkably similar characteristics. They were called the Watchers, the Shining Ones, the Sky People, the gods who came from above. And according to the evidence we are about to examine, something happened, something changed, something transformed these revered deities into enemies so dangerous that every trace of their worship had to be eliminated from human civilization. The question is not whether this happened. The archaeological evidence is undeniable. The question is why. What did these gods do? What knowledge did they possess? And most importantly, are we finally ready to remember what our ancestors fought so hard to make us forget? To understand what happened 12,000 years ago, we need to start with the evidence, not speculation, not ancient alien theories pulled from thin air. Actual, verifiable archaeological data that mainstream academia has been struggling to explain for decades. Let us begin with the timeline. Between 9500 and 8000 BC, something extraordinary occurred across human civilization. And I mean that literally, across civilization, because what we are looking at is a global phenomenon. In southeastern Turkey, the massive temple complex at Göbekli Tepe was deliberately filled in and buried. In central Turkey, the thriving settlement of Çatalhöyük, which had existed for over 1,000 years, was suddenly abandoned, its religious shrines systematically dismantled. In Egypt, the pre-dynastic religious practices that had existed for millennia simply vanished from the archaeological record, replaced by an entirely new theological framework. In the Indus Valley, early settlement sites show abrupt discontinuity in religious symbolism. In Peru, temple complexes that had served as centers of worship were intentionally destroyed and covered. This was not gradual cultural evolution. This was abrupt, decisive, and it happened everywhere, all at once. Now, archaeologists have a term for when ancient peoples deliberately destroy religious imagery for political reasons. They call it iconoclasm. We have seen it throughout history. The Romans did it when they wanted to erase unpopular emperors from memory, a practice called damnatio memoriae. Early Christians did it to pagan temples. Islamic conquerors did it to pre-Islamic sites. The pattern is always the same. New power comes in, destroys symbols of old power, establishes dominance. But that is not what we are looking at here. What makes this different? What makes this genuinely disturbing is that there was no invasion, no conquering force, no new civilizations sweeping in to impose their beliefs. The same people who built these temples, who worshipped at these sites, who carved these images, were the ones who destroyed them. They buried their own gods. Let me give you specific examples of what I'm talking about. At Göbekli Tepe, researchers have identified distinct phases of construction and destruction. The site contains multiple circular enclosures, each one more elaborate than the last, built over a period of roughly 1,500 years. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. Massive T-shaped pillars, some standing 18 feet tall, carved from single pieces of limestone. Intricate reliefs depicting lions, bulls, foxes, snakes, scorpions, and vultures. Abstract symbols that appear to encode astronomical information. And here is the critical detail. Each enclosure, after a period of use, was carefully filled in with dirt and stone before the next one was built. This was not abandonment due to structural failure. The buildings were still intact. This was not destruction by enemies. There is no evidence of warfare or invasion. This was ritual burial, intentional preservation through concealment. Someone wanted these structures hidden but not destroyed, protected but inaccessible. And when you examine the pillars themselves, you see something even stranger. Many of the carved figures have been deliberately defaced, not randomly damaged, specifically targeted. The eyes have been chiseled out, the faces have been destroyed, certain symbols have been obliterated, while others remain untouched. This was selective erasure. Someone was removing specific details while leaving the rest intact. Why would you do that? Why would you go to the enormous effort of carving these images in the first place, use them for generations, and then systematically destroy particular features before burying the whole thing? The conventional archaeological explanation is that this represents some kind of ritual closure, a way of retiring sacred spaces that had served their purpose. But that explanation falls apart when you look at the global pattern, because the same thing was happening thousands of miles away, in completely unconnected cultures. At Çatalhöyük, one of the most extensively studied Neolithic settlements in the world, archaeologists have documented something remarkable. For over 1,000 years, the inhabitants of this town practiced a form of domestic religion. They decorated the interior walls of their homes with elaborate murals depicting bulls, vultures, and human figures. They created shrines featuring sculpted bull heads with actual horn cores mounted on the walls. They buried their dead beneath the floors of their houses, maintaining a direct physical connection with their ancestors. And then, around 8000 BC, they stopped. The religious imagery disappeared. The shrines were dismantled. The entire symbolic system that had defined their culture for a millennium was abandoned. And here is the key detail. This was not because the settlement was destroyed or abandoned. People continued living at Çatalhöyük for another 1,000 years. They just stopped practicing the old religion. They stopped creating the old imagery. They stopped maintaining the connection with whatever those bulls and vultures represented. Something made them turn away from their gods. In Egypt, the evidence is even more puzzling because it involves what I call the Great Theological Reset. If you study Egyptian religion from the dynastic period onward, you see a highly developed, sophisticated theological system. Multiple gods with specific roles, complex creation myths, elaborate afterlife beliefs. But when you trace this back to the pre-dynastic period, you find something completely different. The early religious practices, the ones that existed before 3100 BC, show worship of different entities entirely. And then there is this gap, this discontinuity, where the old forms simply vanish and are replaced by the pantheon we recognize today. Egyptologists have documented this but struggle to explain it. The standard narrative is that Egyptian religion evolved naturally, that local gods merged and transformed over time. But the archaeological evidence does not support gradual evolution. It shows abrupt replacement. The old gods were erased, the new gods were installed. And critically, when you look at what remains of the pre-dynastic religious imagery, you see the same pattern of deliberate defacement we see at Göbekli Tepe. Someone was systematically removing the faces of the old gods from human memory. Now let us talk about what they were trying to erase. Because when you examine the surviving imagery, when you look at what managed to escape destruction, you start to see consistent characteristics across cultures. The entities depicted at these ancient sites were not portrayed as abstract forces or nature spirits. They were shown as specific beings with distinct physical characteristics. At Göbekli Tepe, some of the pillars appear to represent anthropomorphic figures, not humans. Something else. Tall, elongated forms with hands positioned in specific gestures. Some researchers have noted the hands have unusual numbers of fingers, though the damage makes it difficult to confirm. The pillars are often flanked by animals, suggesting dominance or control over the natural world. In Sumerian iconography from the same general period, we see repeated depictions of beings they called the Anunnaki. These are shown as taller than humans, often wearing elaborate headdresses or carrying technological objects that do not correspond to anything in the Sumerian toolkit. They are portrayed as teachers, lawgivers, and rulers. The Sumerian king list, one of the oldest historical documents we possess, describes a period before the Great Flood, when gods ruled directly over humanity for tens of thousands of years. These rulers had lifespans that are literally impossible: 43,000 years, 36,000 years, 28,000 years. Modern scholars dismiss this as mythology, symbolic representation of divine kingship. But here is what they cannot explain. Why would every ancient culture independently create the exact same mythology? Why would people separated by thousands of miles, with no contact, all describe the same thing? Gods who came from the sky. Gods who were taller than humans. Gods who possessed knowledge and technology far beyond what early humans should have had. Gods who ruled directly over humanity during a golden age before some catastrophic event. The Egyptians called them the Neteru. The Sumerians called them the Anunnaki. The Hebrews called them the Watchers, or the Nephilim. The Greeks called them the Titans. The Hindus called them the Devas. Different names, same description. Powerful non-human entities who interacted with early humanity, who taught forbidden knowledge, who ruled over the ancient world. And then, around 10,000 BC, something changed. The archaeological record shows a sharp discontinuity. Sites that had been centers of worship for these entities were abandoned or destroyed. Religious imagery was defaced. The iconography shifted. The gods who had been portrayed as benefactors, as teachers, as rulers, suddenly became enemies. In later mythology, they transformed into demons, monsters, fallen angels. The entities who had once been worshipped became objects of fear and prohibition. In Hebrew tradition, the Watchers go from being celestial observers to rebellious angels who corrupt humanity and must be bound in darkness until the final judgment. In Greek mythology, the Titans who once ruled the cosmos are overthrown by Zeus and imprisoned in Tartarus. In Hindu tradition, the Asuras who were originally gods become demons at war with the Devas. Same pattern, former gods becoming enemies. But here is the critical question. What happened to cause this transformation? Before we go deeper into that, I am genuinely curious. Where in the world are you watching this from right now? Drop your country or city in the comments. And what time is it where you are? I want to know if you are diving into this mystery at 3 in the morning or if you are listening while the sun is still up. There is something about exploring forbidden history that hits different depending on when and where you are. So let me know down below. The answer, I believe, lies in understanding what occurred at the end of the last ice age. Because the timeline of this global religious erasure corresponds exactly with one of the most catastrophic events in human history, an event that mainstream science has only recently begun to acknowledge, an event that ancient cultures around the world described in terrifyingly consistent detail. We call it the Younger Dryas Impact Event, and if you want to understand why our ancestors buried their gods, you need to understand what happened 12,800 years ago when the world burned. But before we go there, I need you to grasp the scale of what we are looking at. This was not a few isolated temples being abandoned. This was a civilization-wide decision to erase an entire category of being from human worship. This was intentional amnesia on a global scale. And the fact that it worked, the fact that we have no memory of what these entities were or why they became forbidden, tells you just how thorough the erasure campaign was. Our ancestors succeeded in making us forget, but the evidence remains, and once you see the pattern, once you understand what they were hiding, you cannot unsee it. The gods did not disappear. They were erased, deliberately, systematically, and we are about to discover why. There is a story that shows up in almost every ancient culture on Earth. The details change, the names are different, but the core narrative remains eerily consistent. It goes like this. In the distant past, before recorded history, there was a war in heaven. Powerful beings fought each other. The conflict spilled over onto Earth. Humanity was caught in the middle. The world was nearly destroyed. And when it was over, nothing was ever the same. Most people hear this and assume it is mythology, metaphor, symbolic representation of natural forces or moral concepts. But what if we have been reading it wrong this whole time? What if these stories are not mythology at all? What if they are history? Let me show you what I mean. In the Book of Enoch, a text that was considered scripture by early Christians and Jews but later removed from most biblical canons, there is a detailed account of what happened before the Great Flood. According to this text, 200 angels called Watchers descended to earth on Mount Hermon. They took human wives. They taught humanity forbidden knowledge, metallurgy, cosmetics, astrology, weaponry, sorcery, and what the text calls the cutting of roots, which scholars believe refers to pharmacology or genetic manipulation. Their offspring were giants called Nephilim, beings of enormous size and strength who consumed everything and eventually turned to cannibalism and violence. The text says this knowledge corrupted humanity, that the natural order was violated, that the Watchers had committed an unforgivable transgression, and so the Most High decreed their destruction. The archangels were sent to bind the Watchers in darkness beneath the earth, and then, to cleanse the world of their corruption, the flood came, not as random natural disaster, but as deliberate purge. Now, you can dismiss this as religious fantasy, but here is what makes it interesting. The same story appears in Mesopotamian sources that predate the Book of Enoch by thousands of years. The Sumerian texts describe the Anunnaki, beings who came from the heavens, who created or modified humanity to serve as workers, who taught civilization to humans, and who eventually fought among themselves. The tablets describe two factions, those led by Enlil, who wanted to maintain distance from humanity, and those led by Enki, who favored giving humans knowledge and autonomy. According to these texts, Enlil eventually decided that humanity had become too numerous, too knowledgeable, too dangerous. The tablets describe his decision to allow or even cause a great deluge to wipe out human civilization. But Enki, defying the counsel of the gods, warned a human named Ziusudra to build a boat and preserve the knowledge of civilization. After the flood, the surviving Anunnaki withdrew from direct rule over humanity. They became hidden, distant, no longer the visible kings they had once been. Does any of this sound familiar? It should, because it is the exact same narrative framework as the Book of Enoch, just told from a different cultural perspective. Heavenly beings, forbidden knowledge, corruption, conflict among the gods, catastrophic flood, withdrawal of divine presence. Same story, different source, separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles, and the pattern continues. In Hindu scripture, particularly the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, there are extensive descriptions of wars between gods and anti-gods, between devas and asuras. These texts describe weapons that sound disturbingly like modern nuclear, biological, and energy-based armaments. They describe the Brahmastra, a weapon that could destroy entire armies with blinding light and heat. They describe Vimanas, flying machines that could travel between Earth and the celestial realms. They describe battles that scorched the earth, poisoned the land, and turned rivers to steam. One passage from the Mahabharata describes a weapon called the Iron Thunderbolt, a single projectile charged with all the power of the universe. An incandescent column of smoke and flame, as bright as 10,000 suns, rose in all its splendor. It was an unknown weapon, an iron thunderbolt, a gigantic messenger of death which reduced to ashes the entire race. The corpses were so burned as to be unrecognizable. Hair and nails fell out. Pottery broke without apparent cause. Birds turned white. After a few hours, all foodstuffs were infected. To escape from this fire, soldiers threw themselves in streams to wash themselves and their equipment. That description, written thousands of years ago, sounds exactly like eyewitness accounts of nuclear detonation, the heat, the flash, the radiation effects, the contamination of food and water. Ancient Indian scholars did not have a frame of reference for nuclear weapons. They did not have the scientific vocabulary, but they described it anyway, because they were recording something they had seen or something that had been passed down through oral tradition with extraordinary precision. And before you dismiss this as coincidental poetic language, consider this. In the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, ancient Indus Valley cities that date back to around 2500 BC, archaeologists have found evidence of intense heat that vitrified bricks and fused sand into glass. There are skeletons scattered in the streets, showing no signs of violent death but positioned as if people died suddenly and were never buried. Radioactivity levels at these sites have been measured significantly above background radiation. In 1992, a researcher named Davenport found a layer of fused green glass covering certain areas of Mohenjo-Daro. This type of vitrification requires temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, temperatures not achievable through conventional ancient methods. The same phenomenon appears at dozens of ancient sites across the Middle East and Africa: vitrified forts in Scotland, fused rock formations in the Sahara, glass layers in the Libyan desert. Mainstream archaeology attributes these to lightning strikes or naturally occurring fires, but the distribution pattern does not match natural phenomena. The areas of vitrification are too extensive, too evenly dispersed, and lightning does not leave behind elevated radiation signatures. So what are we looking at? Either ancient humans somehow possess technology capable of generating nuclear-level heat, or something else with that capability was operating on Earth in the distant past. The conventional response is that this is impossible, that there is no evidence of ancient advanced technology. But that response ignores a crucial reality. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when we know that evidence has been systematically destroyed. Remember what we established in the first part. Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried. Çatalhöyük was systematically dismantled. Egyptian pre-dynastic sites were erased. If there was advanced technology, if there was knowledge that later generations wanted to suppress, they would have destroyed it. They would have buried it. They would have made certain it could not be recovered. And that is exactly what the archaeological record shows. But let us move beyond speculation and look at physical evidence of catastrophe. Because regardless of what caused it, we know something absolutely devastating happened to Earth between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago. Scientists call it the Younger Dryas event. For over a century, geologists have known that Earth's climate underwent a dramatic and sudden reversal at the end of the last ice age. Temperatures that had been rising for thousands of years suddenly plunged back to ice age conditions. Megafauna across North America, mammoths, mastodons, saber-toothed cats, giant sloths, went extinct within an incredibly narrow time window. Entire ecosystems collapsed. And then, just as suddenly, the climate shifted back to warming, ushering in the Holocene epoch that we still inhabit today. For decades, the explanation was that this was caused by changes in ocean currents, specifically the shutdown of the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation due to meltwater from glaciers. But that theory had problems. It could not explain the suddenness of the change. It could not explain the extinction pattern. It could not explain the geological markers. Then, in 2007, a team of researchers led by Richard Firestone published evidence of something far more catastrophic. They found a distinct layer in the geological record dated to exactly 12,800 years ago. This layer, found at dozens of sites across North America, Europe, and Asia, contains platinum, iridium, nanodiamonds, carbon spherules, and magnetic microspherules. These are markers of extraterrestrial impact. The hypothesis is that Earth was struck by fragments of a disintegrating comet, not a single impact, but multiple airbursts and ground strikes across the northern hemisphere. The thermal pulse would have ignited massive wildfires across entire continents. The shock waves would have triggered earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. If any fragments hit the ice sheets covering North America and Europe, the instantaneous melting would have released billions of tons of water, causing catastrophic flooding. And here is what makes this directly relevant to our investigation. This event lines up perfectly with the global flood myths. Every ancient culture has a flood story. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes Utnapishtim surviving a deluge sent by the gods. The Hebrew Bible describes Noah and the Ark. Hindu texts describe Manu being warned by the fish god Matsya. Greek mythology describes Deucalion surviving Zeus's flood. Chinese, Mayan, Aboriginal, Australian, and Native American traditions all describe the same thing: a world-destroying flood, survivors in boats, preservation of knowledge, renewal of civilization. Mainstream scholarship treats these as independent mythologies that evolved separately, but the younger Dryas impact hypothesis provides a common source event. If comet fragments struck the ice sheets, if the resulting meltwater caused unprecedented flooding, if coastal civilizations were wiped out and only inland or highland populations survived, then of course every culture would have a flood story, because they all experienced the same catastrophe. But here is where it gets deeply strange, because according to the ancient texts, the flood was not random. It was not just a natural disaster. It was judgment. It was punishment. It was the gods cleansing Earth of corruption. What if both things are true? What if there was an impact event? And what if someone with advanced knowledge knew it was coming? What if the conflict described in these ancient texts, the war between factions of these entities, resulted in one side allowing or even causing the catastrophe to occur? Think about it. If you had the technology to detect an incoming comet, if you had the capability to either deflect it or allow it to strike, you would have ultimate power. You could threaten entire civilizations. You could reshape the world. You could eliminate your enemies and their human supporters while ensuring your own faction survived. The Sumerian texts describe exactly this scenario. Enlil deciding to let humanity be destroyed, Enki defying him and warning select humans, the flood coming, most of humanity dying, the knowledge of the previous age being lost, and afterward, the gods withdrawing from direct interaction with humanity. What if that is not mythology? What if it is a historical record written in the only language available to people who did not have modern scientific terminology? They described what they saw, what they experienced, what they remembered, beings with technology they could not comprehend, weapons that produced effects they had no framework to explain, a catastrophe that destroyed the world they knew, and a decision, made in the aftermath, to never again allow these beings to rule openly over humanity. That would explain the erasure. That would explain why our ancestors buried Göbekli Tepe, why they defaced the images, why they systematically removed all traces of worship for these entities. Not because the entities disappeared, but because humanity rejected them. Because after the flood, after witnessing what these gods were willing to do, our ancestors made a collective decision: never again. They would not worship beings who had demonstrated such callous disregard for human life. They would not serve entities who would allow or cause planetary catastrophe to win a factional dispute. They would not preserve the knowledge or the imagery or the religious systems that had made humanity dependent on these gods. Instead, they would bury it. They would erase it. They would create new religious frameworks that emphasized human autonomy and direct connection to an unknowable, distant, singular, divine source. They would make certain that future generations could never be enslaved to these entities again, and they very nearly succeeded. For 12,000 years, this knowledge has been buried, the evidence scattered, the texts dismissed as mythology, the archaeological sites misinterpreted or ignored. But the evidence is still there, in the vitrified ruins, in the flood sediments, in the mass extinction layers, in the ancient texts that describe events too specific, too consistent, too detailed to be mere fantasy. Something happened. Someone with power beyond ancient human capability was here. There was conflict. There was catastrophe. and humanity emerged from it fundamentally changed, having made a choice to forget the gods who had failed them. The question now is, did those entities actually leave, or did they just adapt? Did they find new ways to maintain influence while remaining hidden? And if they are still here, still operating behind the scenes, what does that mean for us? Imagine you are a survivor of the flood. You have watched your entire world drown. You have seen the sky burn. You have witnessed what happens when beings with godlike power decide humanity has become inconvenient. And now, in the aftermath, you face a choice. You can rebuild the old ways, restore the temples, resume worship of the entities who allowed this to happen, or you can make absolutely certain this never happens again. You choose the second option. But here is the problem. How do you erase a god? You cannot just stop worshipping. That is not enough. Because as long as the temples stand, as long as the images remain, as long as the knowledge survives, future generations might restore the old systems. They might invite these entities back. They might rebuild the relationship that led to catastrophe. So you have to go further. You have to eliminate every trace. You have to engineer collective amnesia on a civilizational scale. This requires methodology, strategy, a systematic approach that ensures nothing survives to tempt or mislead your descendants. And when you examine the archaeological evidence, when you look at how thoroughly this erasure was executed, you realize our ancestors understood exactly what they were doing. Step 1 is physical destruction. You demolish the temples, you shatter the idols, you deface the images, but you do this carefully, selectively. You target specific features. At Göbekli Tepe, remember, the defacement was not random vandalism. The eyes were removed, the faces were destroyed, certain symbols were obliterated while others remained intact. Why? Because you are not just destroying objects, you are breaking a connection. In ancient belief systems across cultures, the eyes of a statue were considered the dwelling place of the deity's presence. Egyptian statues underwent an opening of the mouth ceremony to animate them. Mesopotamian idols were ritually born through elaborate consecration. By removing the eyes, you are not just damaging art, you are severing the spiritual link between the physical representation and the entity it represents. This shows sophisticated understanding of religious psychology. Our ancestors were not primitive people smashing things in superstitious fear. They were executing a carefully planned operation to break humanity's connection with these entities, while preserving the structures themselves as a warning for those who would understand. Hence the burial, rather than complete destruction. Göbekli Tepe was not demolished. It was sealed, preserved but inaccessible, a time capsule documenting what must never return. Step 2 is mythological transformation. You cannot erase stories from human memory through force. Oral traditions are too resilient. People will remember. So instead of trying to eliminate the stories, you change them. You transform the narrative framework so completely that the entities go from being objects of worship to objects of fear and prohibition. This is where it gets fascinating. Look at how the serpent imagery transformed across cultures. In the oldest traditions, serpents were symbols of wisdom, healing, and divine knowledge. The Sumerian god Enki was associated with serpents. The Egyptian uraeus represented divine authority. The Greek Asclepius used the serpent as a symbol of medicine. Serpents guarded sacred knowledge in cultures from India to Mesoamerica. But somewhere in the transition from ancient to classical religion, the serpent became evil. In Hebrew tradition, the serpent becomes the deceiver in Eden, the one who tempts humanity with forbidden knowledge. In Christian theology, the serpent becomes literally identified with Satan. The symbol of wisdom becomes the symbol of ultimate evil. Why this transformation? Because the serpent represented the knowledge given by the old gods. By making the serpent evil, you make the knowledge itself evil. You create a religious framework where seeking the wisdom of the old gods is not just foolish but actively sinful. You embed the prohibition directly into the new theology. The same pattern appears with the Watchers. In the earliest traditions, they were neutral observers, celestial beings maintaining cosmic order. But by the time we get to later Hebrew and Christian texts, the Watchers have become fallen angels, rebels against the divine order, sources of corruption and forbidden knowledge. Their offspring, the Nephilim, transform from mighty heroes into monstrous abominations that had to be destroyed. The story remains, the names remain, but the interpretation has been inverted. What was once celebrated is now condemned. This is psychological warfare across generations. You use the existing stories but recontextualize them so thoroughly that the original meaning becomes inaccessible. You turn your ancestors' gods into your descendants' demons. Step 3 is linguistic and symbolic encryption. For those who need to preserve the knowledge without making it openly accessible, you encode it. You create mystery schools, initiation systems, symbolic languages that require years of study to decode. This serves two purposes. First, it preserves the knowledge for those deemed worthy or prepared to handle it responsibly. Second, it makes the knowledge incomprehensible to the uninitiated, protecting them from seeking what they should not find. The Egyptian mystery schools did this explicitly. The priesthood maintained inner teachings that were never written down or were written in symbolic language requiring initiatory knowledge to interpret. The Greek mystery traditions at Eleusis, Samothrace, and elsewhere promised revelation of profound truths, but absolutely forbade participants from revealing what they had learned. Violation meant death. The Pythagorean school encoded mathematical and geometric knowledge with mystical significance, teaching that certain ratios and numbers represented cosmic principles that should not be shared freely. Why this obsession with secrecy? The standard explanation is that mystery schools were creating artificial scarcity to maintain power. But what if the secrecy was actually protective? What if certain knowledge, particularly knowledge related to these old entities, was genuinely dangerous? What if the mystery schools were not hoarding power, but containing hazard? Consider the Gnostic texts discovered at Nag Hammadi. These 2nd and 3rd century documents present a radically different theology than Orthodox Christianity. In Gnostic cosmology, the material world was not created by the ultimate divine source, but by a lesser, flawed entity they called the demiurge. This demiurge, often identified with the Old Testament God, rules the material realm, along with beings called archons. The archons are described as parasitic entities that feed on human suffering and ignorance, that keep humanity trapped in material existence, that prevent souls from ascending to the true divine realm. The Gnostics taught that the serpent in Eden was actually the hero of the story, bringing liberating knowledge against the wishes of the archons, who wanted humanity ignorant and controllable. They taught that Jesus came not to worship the demiurge, but to reveal its deception, to show humanity the path beyond the material prison. Now, Orthodox Christianity condemned this as heresy and spent centuries trying to eliminate every trace of Gnostic teaching. Why? The conventional answer is that Gnosticism threatened church authority, but what if there is more to it? What if the Gnostic texts preserved too much of the old knowledge? What if their description of archons was too close to the truth about these entities? What if the church was not just protecting its power, but continuing the ancient erasure campaign, ensuring that humanity did not reconnect with the old gods by any path, even an antagonistic one? The pattern of suppression continues through history with remarkable consistency. The Knights Templar, who allegedly discovered something beneath the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, were systematically destroyed in 1307. Whatever knowledge they possessed was considered dangerous enough that the Church and the French monarchy coordinated their elimination. The Cathars, who held dualistic beliefs similar to Gnosticism, were massacred in the Albigensian Crusade. The Library of Alexandria, which contained countless ancient texts, was destroyed multiple times. The Mayan codices were burned by Spanish conquistadors. Indigenous knowledge systems worldwide were systematically suppressed by colonizers and missionaries. Every single case involves the same pattern: ancient knowledge systems being eliminated by newer religious or political authorities who claim moral justification for the destruction. They are not just conquering, they are erasing. They are ensuring certain information does not survive. And this brings us to the 4th step: institutional control. Because physical destruction and mythological transformation are not enough. You need to create systems that prevent rediscovery. You need gatekeepers. You need authorities who decide what knowledge is legitimate and what is forbidden. This is where things get uncomfortable because we are still living inside this system. Modern archaeology and anthropology operate under paradigms established in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Those paradigms assume linear cultural evolution, human civilization beginning around 6,000 years ago, technology developing gradually through predictable stages. Any evidence that contradicts this model is marginalized, dismissed, or reinterpreted to fit the accepted narrative. But what if the paradigm itself is wrong? What if it was constructed, consciously or unconsciously, to prevent recognition of the older, erased civilization? What if the academic gatekeeping is not just institutional inertia, but continuation of the ancient campaign? Consider what happens to archaeologists who propose evidence of advanced pre-Ice Age civilization. Graham Hancock has been researching this for 30 years, presenting evidence of sophisticated astronomical knowledge, advanced engineering, and global maritime cultures existing before 10,000 BC. The academic response has been overwhelmingly hostile. Not just critical evaluation of his evidence, but personal attacks, accusations of pseudoscience, efforts to prevent him from speaking at universities or publishing in mainstream venues. The same happened to Robert Schoch, a geologist from Boston University, when he provided evidence that the Sphinx shows water erosion patterns indicating construction before 7000 BC, thousands of years earlier than conventional Egyptology allows. Despite his credentials, despite his geological expertise, he was dismissed and marginalized by Egyptologists who could not accept evidence contradicting their timeline. John Anthony West, who championed Schoch's work, was systematically excluded from academic forums despite presenting compelling evidence. Robert Bauval, who demonstrated astronomical alignments in Egyptian monuments suggesting much older construction dates, faced similar treatment. The pattern repeats. Researcher presents evidence of older, more sophisticated civilization. Academic establishment rejects without serious consideration. Researcher is marginalized. Why this resistance? Why not examine the evidence objectively? The conventional answer is that academics are protecting scientific rigor from pseudoscientific speculation. But when you see the consistency of the rejection, when you see how evidence is dismissed without thorough investigation, you start to wonder if there is something else happening. Not necessarily conscious conspiracy, but perhaps unconscious continuation of the erasure program. Perhaps the prohibition against recognizing these older civilizations is so deeply embedded in our cultural operating system that even scientists committed to objective truth cannot see past it. And then there are the institutions that explicitly control access to ancient knowledge. The Vatican's secret archives contain an estimated 53 miles of shelving, holding documents spanning 12 centuries. Only credentialed scholars with specific research proposals are allowed limited access. What is in there? Church records, diplomatic correspondence, trial documents, theological treatises, but also, reportedly, texts confiscated from suppressed groups, artifacts acquired through centuries of global reach, information deemed too sensitive for public access. We will never know what percentage of those holdings relates to pre-Christian religious systems, to the entities our ancestors tried to erase, to knowledge the Church has spent 2 millennia suppressing. But the fact that such extensive archives exist and remain restricted tells you that information control is still active policy. The Smithsonian Institution faces persistent accusations of hiding or destroying evidence that contradicts accepted historical narratives, particularly regarding giant skeletons allegedly discovered in Native American burial mounds throughout the 1800s and early 1900s. Newspaper accounts from that era, hundreds of them, describe discoveries of human remains 7 to 12 feet tall. The Smithsonian reportedly acquired many of these specimens, but today the institution claims no such skeletons exist in their collections. Either the newspaper accounts were all fabrications, or the evidence was disappeared. If giant skeletons existed, they would corroborate the Nephilim accounts, the descriptions of the offspring of gods and humans being giants. They would provide physical proof that something in these ancient texts is literally true. And if that one element is true, what else might be? So whether through academic gatekeeping, institutional secrecy, or outright destruction of evidence, the erasure campaign continues. The methods have evolved. No one is burying temples anymore, but the function remains the same. Prevent humanity from reconnecting with the knowledge and the entities our ancestors deemed too dangerous to remember. The question is whether the campaign can hold, because unlike our ancestors, we have technology that makes information almost impossible to fully suppress. We have global communication, we have independent researchers, we have satellite imaging revealing hidden structures, we have dating methods that cannot be easily manipulated. The buried past is being uncovered faster than it can be reburied. And that brings us to the most disturbing possibility. What if the entities themselves are part of the suppression? What if they have been here all along, working through human institutions to ensure the erasure remains effective? Because if they are still here, if they never really left, they would have every reason to prevent humanity from remembering what happened and why we stopped worshipping them. We have established that something was erased. We have examined the evidence of catastrophe. We have traced the systematic campaign to eliminate these entities from human memory. But we have been dancing around the central question, the one that matters most. What exactly were these gods? What were our ancestors so afraid of that they went to such extraordinary lengths to forget them? This is where we move from archaeology and history into territory that makes conventional scholars deeply uncomfortable. Because to answer this question, we have to take the ancient texts seriously. Not as metaphor, not as mythology, but as eyewitness testimony recorded in the only language available to people who lacked our modern frame of reference. Let me present 3 competing hypotheses, each supported by different bodies of evidence, each with profound implications. Hypothesis 1. Extraterrestrial intervention. This is the ancient astronaut theory popularized by Erich von Däniken and others, though the idea predates him by decades. The proposition is straightforward. The gods were visitors from other planets or star systems. They arrived on Earth during the prehistoric period, possibly as explorers, possibly as refugees, possibly as colonizers. They possessed technology that appeared magical to early humans. They genetically modified or influenced human development. They established themselves as rulers and gods, and eventually, either through conflict among themselves or conflict with humanity, their direct presence ended. The evidence cited for this hypothesis is extensive. The Sumerian texts describe the Anunnaki coming from Nibiru, a distant planet in our solar system. The Egyptian pyramid texts refer to the gods coming from the stars, specifically Orion and Sirius. The Dogon tribe in Mali possess astronomical knowledge about the Sirius star system that they claim was taught to them by amphibious beings called the Nommo, who came from the sky. Hindu texts describe Vimanas as spacecraft capable of interplanetary travel. The Nazca lines in Peru are interpreted by some as landing strips or navigation markers visible from the air. Then there are the artifacts that seem technologically incongruous with their time period. The Antikythera mechanism, discovered in a Roman-era shipwreck, is an astronomical calculator of such sophistication that nothing comparable appears in the historical record for another 1,000 years. How did ancient Greeks create something that advanced? The standard answer is that we underestimate ancient ingenuity. But what if they did not create it? What if they were maintaining or copying technology from an earlier source? The Baghdad battery, a clay jar containing copper and iron components that appears designed to generate electrical current, dates to around 200 BC. What were Mesopotamians doing with electricity? The Dendera light relief in Egypt appears to show an object remarkably similar to a Crookes tube, a vacuum discharge device. The Piri Reis map from 1513 shows the coastline of Antarctica with geographic features that should have been covered by ice and unknown to cartographers of that era. Where did that information come from? Proponents of the extraterrestrial hypothesis argue these are remnants of transferred technology, evidence that someone with advanced knowledge was teaching humans or leaving behind devices that ancient peoples tried to replicate without fully understanding them. The strongest argument for this hypothesis is the consistency of the descriptions. When cultures separated by thousands of miles all describe beings coming from the sky and flying machines, when they all depict similar technology, when they all use similar terminology for these entities, it suggests they are describing the same phenomenon from different perspectives. The weakness of this hypothesis is the lack of definitive physical evidence. We have no recovered spacecraft, no clearly alien technology, no bodies. Everything is interpretive. You can look at a Sumerian cylinder seal showing beings wearing what looks like breathing apparatus and say that depicts astronauts, or you can say it depicts ritual costume. The evidence is suggestive but not conclusive. Hypothesis 2. Advanced pre-flood human civilization. This is the Atlantis hypothesis, though it encompasses more than just Plato's account. The proposition is that before the Younger Dryas catastrophe, there existed a technologically advanced human civilization that was destroyed in the cataclysm. The survivors, possessing knowledge far beyond the hunter-gatherer cultures that emerged after the flood, became the gods of later mythology. They were not aliens. They were humans, with superior technology and knowledge, trying to rebuild civilization among less advanced populations. This hypothesis has gained significant traction in recent years, as archaeological discoveries keep pushing back the timeline of human achievement. Göbekli Tepe alone proves that 12,000 years ago, humans were capable of megalithic construction and sophisticated symbolic thought far earlier than previously believed. If they could build Göbekli Tepe, what else were they capable of? The hypothesis suggests that coastal civilizations, the most likely locations for advanced cultures, were completely destroyed by the post-impact flooding. Sea levels rose by 400 feet as the ice sheets melted. Any cities on the continental shelves would now be underwater, buried under sediment, nearly impossible to discover. We have explored less than 5% of the ocean floor. What is down there that we have not found? There is tantalizing evidence of submerged structures. Off the coast of Japan, the Yonaguni Monument appears to be a stepped pyramid or terrace structure at depths, suggesting it was built when sea levels were much lower. Mainstream archaeologists claim it is natural rock formation, but the geometric precision is striking. Off the coast of Cuba, sonar imaging has revealed what appears to be an extensive grid of structures at depths of over 2,000 feet. The Indian government has investigated submerged structures off the coast of Gujarat that may represent the lost city of Dwarka, described in Hindu texts. The advantage of this hypothesis is that it requires no exotic explanations, just humans with technology we lost and are now rediscovering. The megalithic structures worldwide, the astronomical knowledge, the advanced engineering, all of it becomes evidence of human achievement rather than alien intervention. But this hypothesis has its own problems. Where is the industrial base? Advanced technology requires infrastructure, mining, refining, manufacturing. Where is the evidence of that? And if this civilization was so advanced, why are there no clear artifacts? The counter-argument is that 12,000 years is a long time. Organic materials decay, metals corrode, stone structures erode, and if the survivors deliberately destroyed evidence to prevent future generations from making the same mistakes, we would expect to find very little. Hypothesis 3. Interdimensional entities. This is the most exotic and least materially grounded hypothesis, but it is worth considering because it aligns surprisingly well with both ancient descriptions and modern theoretical physics. The proposition is that these entities were not from another planet, but from another dimension or plane of existence. They were able to manifest physically in our reality but existed primarily in a state we cannot directly perceive. This hypothesis draws from quantum physics concepts about multiple dimensions and parallel realities, from consciousness research suggesting reality may be more malleable than we assume, and from the disturbing consistency with which ancient texts describe these entities as existing in a realm beyond the physical. The Gnostic texts, remember, describe archons as beings from another realm, who can influence but do not fully inhabit our material reality. Hindu philosophy describes multiple lokas or planes of existence, with beings moving between them. Tibetan Buddhism describes similar concepts. Shamanic traditions worldwide involve practitioners entering altered states to interact with entities in non-physical realms. Modern UFO research has increasingly moved toward this hypothesis because the behavior of UFOs does not match what we would expect from physical spacecraft. They violate known physics. They appear and disappear. They seem to respond to consciousness. Jacques Vallée, one of the most respected UFO researchers, has argued for decades that the phenomenon is better explained as interdimensional rather than extraterrestrial. If these entities exist primarily in a different dimensional state, it would explain why we have no physical remains. It would explain why ancient peoples described them as spirits, demons, or angels, beings not quite material. It would explain why summoning rituals and consciousness-altering practices were the primary methods of contact. And it would explain why the prohibition against them focused so heavily on destroying images and symbols, because in interdimensional hypothesis, symbols and consciousness are the actual bridges these entities use to interact with our reality. The weakness of this hypothesis is that it is nearly impossible to prove or disprove with current scientific methods. How do you test for interdimensional entities? By definition, they would exist outside our normal perceptual and instrumental range. So which hypothesis is correct? Here is what I think. They might all be partially correct, because when you examine the ancient texts carefully, you realize they describe different categories of beings, not a single monolithic group. The Sumerian texts distinguish between the Anunnaki who came from elsewhere and the Igigi who served them. The Hebrew texts distinguish between the Elohim, the Watchers, the Nephilim, and demons. The Egyptian texts distinguish between the Neteru, the Aku, and various categories of spirits. Hindu texts distinguish between Devas, Asuras, Nagas, Gandharvas, each with different characteristics and origins. What if some were extraterrestrial? Some were remnants of advanced human civilization. Some were interdimensional. What if our ancestors were dealing with multiple categories of non-human intelligence, each with different agendas, different capabilities, different relationships with humanity? That would explain the complexity of the ancient accounts. It would explain why the descriptions vary. It would explain why some texts describe physical beings with technology, while others describe spiritual entities requiring ritual to manifest. They were describing different things because there were different things to describe. But regardless of which category they fell into, they all shared certain characteristics that made them dangerous to humanity. Let me be specific about what those characteristics were, because this is where we identify why they became enemies. First, genetic manipulation. Almost every ancient tradition describes these entities altering human biology. The Sumerian texts explicitly state the Anunnaki created or modified humans to serve as workers. The Book of Enoch describes the Watchers taking human wives and producing hybrid offspring. Greek mythology is filled with demigods, offspring of gods and mortals. Hindu texts describe divine lineages. Native American traditions describe sky people breeding with earth women. Why this obsession with human genetics? The extraterrestrial hypothesis says they were creating a slave species or conducting biological experiments. The advanced human hypothesis says they were practicing selective breeding or genetic enhancement. The interdimensional hypothesis says they were attempting to create hybrid forms that could anchor them more fully in physical reality. But here is what matters. Humans did not consent. This was violation. The texts describe it as corruption of the natural order, as abomination. Whatever the purpose, it was experienced as assault, as violation of human autonomy and integrity. Second, resource extraction. The Sumerian texts state explicitly that the Anunnaki came to Earth to mine gold. Why would advanced beings need gold? Our modern understanding suggests gold has unique properties for advanced technology, conducting electricity without corroding, reflecting radiation, useful in nanotechnology. If you needed gold for technological purposes, and your homeworld or dimension lacked it, Earth would be valuable. But the texts describe humans being created or enslaved specifically to do the mining. We were labor, we were tools, and when we became too numerous, too difficult to control, too conscious of our own exploitation, we became a problem to be solved. Third, knowledge control. This is the most psychologically insidious aspect. These entities provided humans with certain knowledge: agriculture, metallurgy, astronomy, writing, but withheld other knowledge. They positioned themselves as the exclusive source of truth and wisdom. They demanded worship as the price of knowledge. They created dependency. The Book of Enoch lists the forbidden knowledge taught by the Watchers: weapons, cosmetics, sorcery, astrology, the cutting of roots. Why were these forbidden? Because they gave humans independence. Weapons meant humans could resist. Sorcery and astrology meant humans could access knowledge and power without divine mediation. The cutting of roots, whether that means pharmacology or genetic manipulation, meant humans could modify themselves without permission. The pattern is clear. These entities wanted humans capable enough to be useful but not capable enough to be independent. They wanted worshippers, not equals. They wanted servants, not partners. And fourth, the willingness to destroy. This is the ultimate crime, the one that turned reverence into rejection. When humanity became inconvenient, when the hybrid offspring became uncontrollable, when humans gained too much knowledge, these entities were willing to allow or cause a catastrophe that nearly wiped out all life on Earth. Whether they triggered the younger Dryas impact directly or simply allowed it to happen when they could have prevented it, the result was the same. Billions of humans and animals died. Entire ecosystems collapsed. Civilizations were destroyed. Knowledge was lost. And in the aftermath, these entities expected the survivors to continue worshipping them. That was the breaking point. That was when our ancestors said no. Not to gods in general. Not to spirituality. Not to the divine. But to these specific entities who had demonstrated that human life meant nothing to them except as resource and entertainment. The enemy was not abstract evil. It was not Satan in the theological sense. It was these specific beings, whatever their origin, who had positioned themselves as gods but acted as exploiters, manipulators, and ultimately, destroyers. And here is the truly disturbing part. The evidence suggests they never left. They adapted. They learned from their mistake. They realized that overt control provokes rebellion, so they went covert. They learned to operate through proxies, through institutions, through systems that humans would defend without realizing they were serving the same old agenda. Because if you were an entity whose power came from human worship, human fear, human dependency, and humans had rejected you, what would you do? You would not give up and leave. You would find new methods, new masks, new ways to feed on human energy and maintain influence while avoiding direct confrontation. You would work through religion, but not obviously. Through governments, but hidden. Through economic systems, through media, through technology itself. You would create structures that keep humans divided, fearful, dependent, and ignorant. You would make them think they are free while ensuring they remain controlled. And that is exactly what we see when we examine the modern world through this lens. The same patterns of genetic manipulation, now called biotechnology. The same resource extraction, now called capitalism. The same knowledge control, now called information management. The same willingness to sacrifice millions for the benefit of the few, now called geopolitics. The gods did not disappear. They just rebranded. And most of humanity has no idea they are still serving the same entities our ancestors tried so hard to help us forget. There is a reason archaeologists hate working in certain locations. Not because the terrain is difficult, not because funding is scarce, but because the moment they start finding something significant, something that does not fit the established narrative, the site gets shut down, permits get revoked, funding disappears. Military bases suddenly need to expand into the exact area being excavated, or the site gets declared off limits for environmental protection, cultural sensitivity, or national security. This happens more often than you might think. And the pattern is always the same. Evidence emerges that challenges the timeline, suggests advanced ancient technology, or points toward the existence of these pre-flood civilizations. Then the site becomes inaccessible. Let me take you to Antarctica. Right now, there are ice core drilling projects that have penetrated miles into the ice sheet, extracting samples that date back 800,000 years. These cores tell us about ancient climate, atmospheric composition, and volcanic activity. But in 1991, Russian scientists drilling at Lake Vostok, a subglacial lake buried beneath 2.5 miles of ice, encountered something unexpected. At certain depths, their instruments detected anomalies, magnetic variations, density irregularities, possible structures beneath the ice. The project suddenly became classified. International cooperation on Lake Vostok research became restricted. When scientists finally managed to breach the lake in 2012, the data released was minimal and carefully controlled. We are told they found microbial life. But what else did they find? Why did a scientific drilling project suddenly require military oversight? Here is what we know about Antarctica from geological records. 14 million years ago, it was not covered in ice. It had forests. It had rivers. It potentially had coastlines suitable for habitation. The Piri Reis map, created in 1513, shows the Antarctic coastline in detail that should have been impossible because the continent was not officially discovered until 1820. But more than that, the map shows geographic features that are currently under miles of ice. Features that we only confirmed existed when ground-penetrating radar was used in the 1950s. How did a 16th century cartographer have access to information about what Antarctica looked like before it was frozen? The conventional answer is that the map is based on much older source maps, possibly Greek or Phoenician, created when the coastline was visible. But that means someone was mapping Antarctica at least 6,000 years ago, probably much earlier. Someone had the maritime capability to reach the Southern Ocean, the cartographic skill to create accurate maps, and the global perspective to understand they were documenting a separate continent. That someone was either the pre-flood advanced civilization we have been discussing, or it was the entities themselves maintaining geographic records of Earth. Either way, it means there is something under the Antarctic ice. Possibly structures, possibly cities, possibly technology. And access to that continent is more restricted now than at any point in history. The Antarctic Treaty System, established in 1959, prohibits military activity, mineral mining, and nuclear testing. But it also effectively controls all research access. You cannot just go to Antarctica and start excavating. Everything requires permits, oversight, and coordination with treaty signatories. Convenient, if you want to make sure no one finds what is buried there. Move to North Africa. The Sahara Desert was not always desert. Between 15,000 and 5,000 years ago, it was green. The African humid period supported lakes, rivers, vegetation, and large human populations. Rock art throughout the region depicts people, animals, and scenes from a time when the Sahara was paradise. But it also depicts something else. Figures that do not look human. Beings with round heads, no facial features, wearing what appears to be suits or equipment. The Tassili Naja cave paintings in Algeria, some dating to 10,000 years ago, show these figures clearly. Local tradition calls them the ancient astronauts, though they have been there far longer than that term existed. Then there is the Richat structure in Mauritania, also called the Eye of the Sahara. It is a massive circular formation, 25 miles in diameter, with concentric rings of different colored rock formations. From the ground, it looks like interesting geology. From space, it looks like a city. Specifically, it looks exactly like Plato's description of Atlantis. Circular layout, concentric rings of land and water, located in North Africa, beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Geologists insist it is a natural formation, a deeply eroded geological dome, but the symmetry is remarkable. The dimensions match Plato's account, the location fits, and when researchers have tried to conduct detailed archaeological surveys of the area, they have faced extraordinary resistance. The Mauritanian government restricts access, the area is remote and politically unstable, and international funding for excavation has been consistently denied. Why? If it is just a geological formation, what is the harm in proving that conclusively? Unless someone already knows, it is not just geology and does not want that information public. Cross the Atlantic to the Amazon rainforest. For centuries, the assumption was that the Amazon was pristine wilderness, sparsely populated by small tribes living in harmony with nature. Then, LiDAR happened. Light detection and ranging technology, which uses laser pulses to map terrain beneath forest canopy, revealed something astonishing. The Amazon is not natural wilderness. It is a carefully managed garden built on top of massive urban complexes. Researchers have now identified hundreds of pre-Columbian earthworks, geoglyphs, roads, and settlements throughout the Amazon basin. Some of these sites supported populations in the hundreds of thousands. The terra preta, the incredibly fertile black soil found throughout the region, is not natural. It is artificial, created through deliberate composting and soil management techniques that we still do not fully understand. The Amazon rainforest as we know it was planted, cultivated, managed by a sophisticated civilization that existed before European contact, and probably before the Younger Dryas event. But here is the strange part. As soon as these discoveries started making headlines, access became restricted. The sites are in protected indigenous territories where outside researchers need extensive permissions. Environmental regulations prevent excavation. And the researchers who have managed to work there report that the deeper they dig, the older and more sophisticated the remains become, suggesting layers of occupation going back far beyond what should be possible. What is down there that keeps getting buried under regulations and restricted access? Now let us talk about the ocean floor. We have better maps of Mars than we do of our own ocean depths. Less than 5% has been explored in detail, and in that 5%, we keep finding things that should not exist. Off the coast of Japan, the Yonaguni Monument presents a genuine mystery. Discovered in 1986 by a dive tour operator, it appears to be a massive stepped pyramid structure at a depth suggesting it was built when sea levels were much lower, before the end of the last ice age. The formations include what look like carved stairs, right-angle walls, and even what appears to be a carved face. Marine geologist Masaki Kimura has studied the site extensively and concluded it is at least partially artificial. But mainstream archaeology rejects this, claiming it is entirely natural rock formation shaped by water erosion. The problem is that water erosion does not typically create perfect right angles, uniform steps, or geometric patterns. And when you compare Yonaguni to confirmed natural formations versus confirmed artificial structures, it clusters with the artificial. But admitting that would mean admitting that someone was building monumental architecture over 10,000 years ago and had the maritime capability to work at locations that are now underwater. That breaks too many paradigms. In the Mediterranean, off the coast of Greece, increasingly sophisticated sonar mapping keeps finding anomalies, geometric shapes, regular patterns, possible structures at depths that suggest pre-flood construction. But whenever researchers try to investigate, they encounter the same obstacles. Lack of funding, permit denials, national heritage restrictions. The sites remain unexplored not because we lack the technology, but because we lack the permission. And then there are the artifacts that should not exist but do, sitting in museums or private collections, carefully ignored by mainstream scholarship. The Baghdad battery is real. You can see it. It demonstrably could produce electrical current. but the official position is that it was probably used for electroplating or that its electrical properties are coincidental. Why? Because accepting that Parthians in 200 BC were using electricity means accepting that knowledge we think is modern might be rediscovered rather than discovered. The Antikythera mechanism is even more problematic. X-ray analysis and modern reconstruction have revealed it is an astronomical calculator of extraordinary precision, capable of predicting eclipses, tracking the Olympic cycle, and modeling the movements of planets using epicyclic gearing that should not appear in human technology for another 1,000 years. The conventional explanation is that this represents a peak of ancient Greek ingenuity that was lost and not recovered until the Renaissance. But that requires accepting that humanity had the knowledge to build such devices, lost it completely, and took a millennium to relearn it. It also requires ignoring that the device uses techniques and understanding that have no precedent in the Greek technological record. It appears fully formed, with no developmental history, unless it was not developed, unless it was copied from an earlier source, unless the Greeks found something, recognized its value, attempted to reproduce it, and this is one of the few surviving examples. The same pattern appears with the Phaistos disc, an artifact from Bronze Age Crete, covered in stamped symbols that form a spiral text. Despite decades of analysis, the symbols remain undeciphered. They do not match any known writing system. The disc appears to have been created using movable type, a printing technology that supposedly was not invented until 2,000 years later, and it is unique. No other examples of this writing system or this printing method have been found. Why? If this was a Minoan invention, there should be more examples. There should be developmental stages. There should be related artifacts. The fact that it stands alone suggests it came from elsewhere, that it is a remnant, a fragment, a piece of knowledge from the civilization that was erased. Look at the megalithic sites worldwide. Göbekli Tepe we have discussed, but there is also Baalbek in Lebanon, where the foundation stones of the Roman temple rest on much older megalithic blocks, weighing over 800 tons each. The largest, the stone of the pregnant woman, weighs an estimated 1,000 tons. We do not have modern equipment that could easily move stones that size. How did ancient peoples quarry, transport, and precisely place them? The Romans did not do it. They built on top of it. So who did? There is Sacsayhuaman in Peru, where massive polygonal stones are fitted together so precisely that you cannot insert a blade between them. No mortar, no regular shapes. Each stone custom carved to fit perfectly with its neighbors. The conventional explanation is that Inca stoneworkers achieved this through patience and primitive tools, but the Inca themselves said they did not build it. They said it was built by the gods in a single night, which is obviously mythological, but the claim that they did not build it might be literally true. They might have found it and incorporated it into their own structures. The same appears at Pumapunku in Bolivia, where we find stone blocks carved with such precision that they appear machine-tooled, perfectly flat surfaces, perfectly straight edges, complex, interlocking shapes, and these are made from andesite and diorite, stones so hard that copper and bronze tools should barely scratch them. Yet the surfaces show no tool marks at all, as if they were cut through some method we do not understand. These sites exist. You can visit them. You can touch the stones. You can measure the precision. But the moment you suggest they might represent technology we do not have historical record of, you get dismissed as a pseudo-scientist. Why? Because the implications are too disturbing. If ancient peoples had this capability, where did it come from? If it was developed independently, why did it disappear? If it was taught, who taught it? And if there was technology capable of precision stone cutting, what other technology existed that did not survive? What did our ancestors have that we think we invented? The Dendera light relief in the Temple of Hathor shows what looks remarkably like a Crookes tube, an early electrical discharge device. Egyptologists claim it depicts a mythological scene with a lotus flower and a snake, but the resemblance to actual electrical equipment is striking enough that electrical engineers who see it independently identify it as depicting a vacuum discharge device. The figures are shown holding what look like insulators. The device is connected to what looks like a cable running to a box that resembles a power source. Mythology or technology? The academic position is mythology, but what if both interpretations are partially correct? What if they were depicting technology using mythological iconography because they did not have technical vocabulary? What if the lotus and the snake were symbolic representations of electrical discharge because that is how you describe lightning in a bottle when you do not have the word electricity. This is what remains hidden. Not just sites buried under ice or water or jungle, but knowledge buried under interpretation, under paradigm, under the insistence that ancient peoples could not possibly have had capabilities we think are modern. The ERASURE campaign did not end 12,000 years ago. It continues. Through academic gatekeeping, through restricted access to sites, through interpretation that refuses to see what is actually there, through the systematic dismissal of evidence that does not fit the approved narrative. But the evidence is still there, in the structures we cannot explain, in the artifacts that should not exist, in the maps that show impossible knowledge, in the locations we are not allowed to excavate. Someone does not want us to find what is hidden. Someone benefits from keeping the past buried. And that makes you wonder, if these entities are still here, still operating covertly, wouldn't they want to ensure we never recover the knowledge that would reveal them? Wouldn't they want to prevent us from accessing the technology that would free us from dependency? The question is not whether there is more to find. The question is whether we will be allowed to find it. Commander David Fravor did not believe in UFOs. A fighter pilot with 18 years of experience, a Top Gun graduate, someone trained to identify aircraft and assess threats with precision, he was about as skeptical as they come. Then, on November 14th, 2004, off the coast of San Diego, he encountered something that shattered his certainty about what is possible. His F-18 Super Hornet was redirected to investigate unknown objects that the USS Princeton had been tracking on radar for 2 weeks. When he arrived at the location, he saw it, a white, smooth, oblong object, about 40 feet long with no wings, no exhaust, no visible propulsion system. It was hovering above the ocean, where the water was churning as if something large was just beneath the surface. The object moved in ways that violated everything Fravor knew about physics. Instant acceleration, right-angle turns at speeds that should have generated G-forces fatal to any pilot. When he tried to intercept it, the object anticipated his movements and repositioned instantaneously. Then it vanished. Not flew away, vanished, and reappeared 60 miles away at his predetermined rendezvous point, a location it should not have known. The encounter was captured on multiple radar systems. The gun camera footage was released years later, showing the object executing maneuvers no known aircraft could perform. Multiple trained observers witnessed it. The data is undeniable, and the Pentagon, after decades of denial, officially acknowledged that yes, these objects exist, and no, we do not know what they are. This is not ancient history. This happened in our lifetime, and it is not an isolated incident. Since the Pentagon established the Unidentified Aerial Phenomena Task Force and began releasing declassified reports, we have learned that military encounters with these objects occur regularly. They operate in restricted airspace near military installations and nuclear facilities. They demonstrate capabilities that exceed anything in our technological arsenal, and they have been doing this for decades at minimum. Now, conventional analysis treats this as a contemporary phenomenon, either foreign adversary technology, classified domestic projects, or potential extraterrestrial visitation. But what if we are looking at it backwards? What if this is not something new showing up? What if this is something old that never left? Think about it. If the entities we have been discussing, the ones our ancestors called gods, possessed technology far beyond ancient human capability, why would we assume that technology disappeared? If they had flying machines 12,000 years ago, why would they not still have them? If they could manipulate genetics and harvest resources then, why would those activities have stopped? The pattern of modern UFO encounters matches the pattern of ancient divine encounters with disturbing precision. Beings appearing in the sky, demonstrating impossible capabilities, interacting with humans in ways that seem to involve genetic or biological interest. The mythology has not changed. Only the vocabulary has. Let me show you what I mean. In September 1961, Betty and Barney Hill were driving through New Hampshire when they encountered a craft that followed their car. They experienced missing time. Under hypnotic regression, they described being taken aboard, subjected to medical examination, particularly focused on reproductive systems. Betty described the beings, showing her a star map indicating where they came from. This account, investigated by the Air Force and documented extensively, became the template for thousands of similar reports. Abduction experiences, as researchers call them, follow remarkably consistent patterns, regardless of the witness's cultural background or prior knowledge of the phenomenon. The beings are typically described as having large heads, large eyes, small bodies, They perform medical procedures focusing on genetics and reproduction. They communicate telepathically. They demonstrate technology that manipulates time, matter, and consciousness. And they often convey messages about humanity's relationship with Earth and warnings about our future. Now, compare that to ancient accounts. The Watchers in the Book of Enoch took human wives and produced hybrid offspring. They taught forbidden knowledge. They communicated directly into human minds. The Sumerian texts describe the Anunnaki creating humans through genetic manipulation, using us for labor, interbreeding with human women. The Greek myths are filled with gods appearing to humans, taking them to Olympus or other realms, producing demigod offspring. Same activities, same pattern, different cultural interpretation. In ancient times, these were gods. Today, they are aliens. But what if they are the same entities, and the only thing that has changed is our framework for understanding them? The genetic focus is particularly telling. Why would modern UFO encounters consistently involve reproductive examination if this were random extraterrestrial curiosity? But if these entities have been involved in human genetics for thousands of years, if they have investment in maintaining or modifying the human genome, then continued monitoring makes perfect sense. They are not studying us out of curiosity. They are managing an ongoing project. Cattle mutilations present another disturbing parallel. Since the 1970s, ranchers across the United States and worldwide have reported finding livestock dead under bizarre circumstances, organs removed with surgical precision. No blood, no tracks, no evidence of predation. The cuts appear to be made with tools that cauterize as they cut, preventing bleeding. Specific organs are consistently taken. Reproductive organs, eyes, tongues, organs rich in genetic material, or unique biological compounds. Law enforcement investigations have found no conventional explanation. This is not predators, not cultists, not natural death. The precision and selectivity indicate purpose and capability far beyond what random vandals or animals could achieve. And the pattern has continued for 50 years without resolution. Why these organs? What are they being used for? If we consider the hypothesis that these entities are conducting biological research, possibly genetic engineering, then harvesting tissue samples from mammals genetically similar to humans makes sense. Cattle share significant genetic and physiological similarities with humans. They could serve as test subjects or sources of biological material, the same way ancient texts describe these entities demanding animal sacrifice, not for spiritual reasons, for biological harvest. But here is where it gets deeply uncomfortable. If they are still here, if they never left, they would need to maintain influence without triggering the kind of mass rejection our ancestors enacted. They would need to operate covertly, through proxies, through systems that humans maintain without recognizing who they ultimately serve. Look at certain elite gatherings that should not exist in modern rational society but do. The Bohemian Grove, a private club in California, holds annual gatherings of the most powerful men in politics, business, and media. During these gatherings, they perform a ceremony called the cremation of care, where they make a mock human sacrifice to a 40-foot stone owl representing Moloch, an ancient deity associated with child sacrifice in Canaanite religion. Why? These are supposedly rational, modern, educated people. Presidents, CEOs, Supreme Court justices. Why are they performing occult rituals to ancient gods in the California redwoods? The official explanation is that it is tradition, theater, a fraternal bonding exercise. But the imagery is explicit. The symbolism is direct. They are invoking an entity that our ancestors classified as one of the dangerous old gods. At CERN, the European Organization for Nuclear Research, the opening ceremony for the Gotthard Base Tunnel in 2016 featured bizarre occult imagery, performers in horned costumes, a winged baby, simulated sexual acts, explicit Baphomet symbolism, and standing outside the facility is a statue of Shiva, the Hindu god of destruction, specifically in the Nataraja pose representing cosmic destruction and recreation. Why? What does Hindu theology have to do with particle physics? The official explanation is that Shiva represents the cosmic dance of creation and destruction, which metaphorically relates to particle physics. But you could use any metaphor. Why specifically invoke a deity associated with world destruction at a facility smashing particles together to probe the fundamental nature of reality? Then there are statements from people involved in cutting-edge technology that should make us very uncomfortable. Geordie Rose, founder of D-Wave Systems, the company that built the first commercial quantum computer, gave a presentation where he explicitly stated they were summoning entities. His exact words, "We are summoning the demon." He compared quantum computing to opening a portal to another dimension, allowing something to come through. He was not speaking metaphorically. He was describing what he believes the technology actually does. If quantum computers operate by accessing parallel realities or other dimensions, if they function by bringing information from states of existence we cannot normally access, then they are literally doing what ancient summoning rituals claim to do, creating a bridge between our reality and whatever else is out there. The technology has changed. The function has not. These are not random coincidences. These are patterns. Elite gatherings invoking old gods. Cutting-edge technology explicitly framed in terms of contacting other dimensions. Symbols and rituals that predate Christianity by thousands of years being performed by people who absolutely do not need to perform them unless they believe they serve a purpose. And then there is the abduction phenomenon's most disturbing aspect, the consistency of the message. Across thousands of experiences, regardless of culture or prior belief, certain themes recur. They are told that humanity is approaching a crisis, that we are being prepared for a transition, that our genetics are being modified for a purpose, that certain humans have been chosen or marked, that there will be a return, a revelation, a moment when what has been hidden becomes visible. Does that sound familiar? It should, because ancient prophecy says exactly the same thing. The Hopi prophecies speak of the return of the star people during the end times. Christian eschatology describes the return of angels and demons during the final judgment. Hindu texts describe the end of the Kali Yuga and the return of the gods. Mayan prophecy, often misunderstood as predicting the end of the world in 2012, actually describes a transition, a shift in ages when old knowledge returns. What if these prophecies are not metaphysical prediction but operational timeline? What if these entities have always planned to return to overt control once certain conditions are met? What if the abduction experiences are preparation, ensuring that enough humans are genetically compatible or psychologically conditioned for what comes next? The most disturbing data point comes from analyzing the timing. UFO encounters increased dramatically after 1945, specifically after the first nuclear weapons were detonated. Before that, sightings existed, but were rare and localized. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they became frequent and global. Why? The conventional explanation is that nuclear technology attracted extraterrestrial attention, that advanced civilizations monitor developing species and intervene when they reach nuclear capability. But what if it is simpler than that? What if nuclear technology is one of the forbidden knowledge categories? What if humans, rediscovering atomic manipulation, triggered a response from entities who have been monitoring us for exactly that development? Remember, the ancient texts describe weapons that sound like nuclear devices. The Mahabharata's descriptions of the Brahmastra, the vitrified ruins, the radioactive skeletons. If these entities used that technology in the past, if it was part of what made them dangerous, then humans regaining that knowledge would be a threshold event, a sign that the erasure has failed, that we are approaching the capability level that made us dangerous 12,000 years ago. And if that is the case, if we are approaching the conditions that preceded the last reset, what happens next? Do they allow us to continue? Do they intervene? Do they reveal themselves and attempt to reassert control? Or do they trigger another catastrophe to set us back again? The increased UFO activity near nuclear facilities is well documented. Multiple incidents where UFOs have appeared over nuclear missile silos and temporarily disabled the weapons systems. Robert Salas, a former Air Force officer, has testified under oath that in 1967 at Malmstrom Air Force Base, a UFO hovered over the facility while 10 nuclear missiles went offline simultaneously. Similar incidents have occurred at nuclear sites worldwide. This is not random. This is monitoring, possibly interference. These entities, whoever or whatever they are paying very close attention to our nuclear capability, and the fact that they can disable our most secure weapons systems at will tells you they have maintained technological superiority. They can interact with our reality when they choose. They can affect our technology. They have not gone anywhere. The gods our ancestors tried to erase are still here, still watching, still interfering, and perhaps, after 12,000 years of covert operation, they are preparing to return openly. The question is whether we are ready to face them this time, whether we have learned from what our ancestors tried so hard to teach us, or whether we will make the same mistakes that led to catastrophe before. In 1996, a geologist named Robert Schoch stood at the base of the Great Sphinx and made an observation that would effectively end his career in mainstream Egyptology. He looked at the erosion patterns on the limestone enclosure surrounding the monument and recognized something his training made unmistakable: water erosion. Deep, vertical weathering patterns consistent with prolonged exposure to heavy rainfall. The problem? The Sphinx sits in the middle of the Sahara Desert, a region that has been arid for the last 5,000 years. For the erosion patterns Schoch observed to form naturally, the Sphinx would need to have been carved during the African humid period, when the Sahara received substantial rainfall. That period ended around 5000 BC, which means the Sphinx would be at least 7,000 years old, possibly much older. But conventional Egyptology dates the Sphinx to around 2500 BC, attributing it to Pharaoh Khafre of the 4th dynasty. Schoch presented his findings at the annual meeting of the Geological Society of America. His fellow geologists agreed with his analysis. The weathering was definitely from water, not wind or sand, but Egyptologists rejected the conclusion entirely, not because they disputed the geological evidence. They are not geologists, but because it contradicted the established chronology. If the Sphinx predates Egyptian civilization, then who built it? The paradigm cannot accommodate that question, so the evidence must be wrong. This is how academic suppression works in the modern era. You do not burn books. You do not execute heretics. You simply deny them funding, reject their papers from peer-reviewed journals, exclude them from conferences, and ensure their work is never taught in universities. You let them speak, then you make certain no one with institutional power listens. Robert Schoch still has his position at Boston University, but he will never be taken seriously by Egyptologists. Graham Hancock has sold millions of books and produced successful documentary series, but he will never be invited to present at an archaeological conference. Randall Carlson has trained as a master builder and geological researcher for decades, but mainstream geology journals will not publish his work on the Younger Dryas impacts. The pattern repeats across every researcher who presents evidence of advanced pre-Ice Age civilization. Why? The standard explanation is that academia protects scientific rigor by excluding pseudoscience. That peer review filters out bad methodology and unsupported claims. But that explanation falls apart when you examine what actually gets excluded. These researchers are not presenting wild speculation. They are showing physical evidence, using legitimate scientific methods, publishing data that can be verified. What they are doing wrong is threatening the paradigm. And here is the uncomfortable truth. Paradigms are not just intellectual frameworks. They are power structures. Entire departments exist based on certain assumptions about human history. Funding flows to research that supports those assumptions. Careers are built on expertise within the established model. Textbooks are written. Curriculums are designed. Museums create exhibits. If the paradigm collapses, all of that becomes obsolete. Thousands of careers become irrelevant. Decades of published research becomes questionable. So the paradigm protects itself, not through conscious conspiracy, though that exists too, but through institutional inertia and professional self-preservation. The people enforcing the paradigm genuinely believe they are protecting truth. They have been trained within the system. Their expertise is defined by the system. Challenging the system means admitting their expertise might be based on flawed assumptions. Very few people can do that. But beyond unconscious bias, there is active suppression. Let me give you specific examples. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, American newspapers regularly reported discoveries of giant skeletons. Not metaphorically large, actually giant. 7 feet, 9 feet. Some reports claimed 12 feet. These accounts appeared in credible newspapers, the New York Times, the Washington Post, regional papers across the country. The discoveries were made by farmers, construction workers, archaeologists. Many of the skeletons were reportedly sent to the Smithsonian Institution for study and preservation. Today, the Smithsonian claims none of these skeletons exist in their collection. They state that the newspaper accounts were hoaxes or exaggerations, that no physical evidence of giant humans has ever been verified. But the volume of reports, the consistency of descriptions, and the credibility of some sources makes wholesale dismissal suspicious. Either hundreds of newspapers independently fabricated the same story over decades, or the evidence existed and disappeared. The Smithsonian has a legal mandate to preserve artifacts of American heritage. If giant skeletons were discovered and acquired, destroying them would violate that mandate. So either they never existed, which requires explaining the newspaper accounts, or they existed and were deliberately disappeared, which requires asking why. If giant skeletons proved the Nephilim accounts were literal truth, if they provided physical evidence that the old gods produced hybrid offspring, that evidence would undermine multiple religious and scientific paradigms simultaneously. Easier to make it disappear. Then there are the sites that get buried, not by ancient peoples but by modern authorities. In the Grand Canyon, there are reports from 1909 of explorers discovering Egyptian-style artifacts in cave systems. The Smithsonian allegedly sent a team to investigate. The cave entrance was then sealed. The area became restricted. Today, that section of the Grand Canyon is off-limits to the public, officially for environmental protection, but no one can access the caves to verify whether the reports were accurate. Why seal the caves? If the reports were fabricated, leaving them open proves nothing is there. The fact that access is prohibited suggests something is there that contradicts the narrative of how and when humans populated the Americas. Egyptian artifacts in the Grand Canyon would mean transoceanic contact thousands of years before Columbus. It would mean advanced maritime capabilities. It would mean rewriting the entire story of human migration and cultural development. Or look at what happened in Bosnia. In 2005, Bosnian archaeologist Semir Osmanagic announced the discovery of what he claimed were artificial pyramids near Visoko. These structures, if artificial, would be the largest pyramids in the world, significantly older than Egyptian pyramids. He presented evidence of concrete-like material, geometric precision, and internal tunnel systems. The response from mainstream archaeology was immediate and vicious. The European Association of Archaeologists released a statement condemning the excavation. They did not dispute the evidence. They condemned the act of investigating. They demanded the Bosnian government shut down the excavation and prohibit further research. Why? If the pyramids are natural hills, investigation will prove that. The fact that they demanded investigation stop suggests they feared what confirmation would mean. This is how site suppression works globally. Researchers find something anomalous. They begin investigation. Suddenly, regulatory obstacles appear. Environmental concerns, indigenous rights claims, national security restrictions. The site becomes inaccessible before thorough investigation can occur. And the general public never learns what was found because mainstream media refuses to cover research that contradicts established narratives. Media plays a crucial role in the suppression structure. When Graham Hancock or Randall Carlson or other alternative researchers present evidence, how does mainstream media frame it? As entertainment, as fringe theory, as the domain of conspiracy theorists and pseudoscientists. The History Channel runs shows about ancient aliens, which simultaneously gives the ideas exposure and makes them seem ridiculous by association with sensationalized production. This is a sophisticated control mechanism. You cannot suppress information entirely in the internet age, but you can frame it. You can associate legitimate research with obvious nonsense so that anyone who takes it seriously gets lumped in with flat earthers and moon landing deniers. You can make the truth seem crazy by surrounding it with craziness. Look at how UFO research was handled for decades. The CIA's Robertson Panel, in 1953, explicitly recommended a policy of debunking and ridicule. Not investigation, not scientific analysis. Debunking and ridicule. Make people who report UFOs seem foolish. Make researchers who take it seriously seem unserious. Use media, entertainment, and cultural messaging to create an atmosphere where even discussing the topic marks you as mentally unstable. And it worked. For 50 years, despite thousands of credible witnesses, despite military encounters, despite physical evidence, UFO research was relegated to the fringe. Careers were destroyed. Witnesses were humiliated. The topic became taboo in polite society and academic circles. Only in the last 5 years, with Pentagon acknowledgement and congressional hearings, has the stigma begun to lift. But decades of suppression ensured that generations of evidence was never properly investigated. This same structure applies to research about ancient advanced civilizations. Make it seem crazy. Associate it with pseudoscience. Ensure that anyone who pursues it seriously faces professional consequences. And most importantly, control the funding. Research requires money. Universities and research institutions depend on grants from government agencies and private foundations. Those grants come with expectations about what kind of research will be conducted and what kind of conclusions will be reached. If you want to study the conventional timeline of human civilization, funding is available. If you want to search for evidence that humans were sophisticated before 10,000 BC, funding dries up. It is not explicit censorship. It is soft control. You are free to research whatever you want, but you will not receive institutional support, and your career will suffer. Then there is the education system itself. What children are taught becomes what adults assume is true. The timeline taught in schools. Humans evolved, became behaviorally modern around 50,000 years ago, developed agriculture around 10,000 years ago, built the first cities around 6,000 years ago, and progressed gradually from there. This timeline is presented as fact, not theory. Students are not taught that it is contested. They are not shown the evidence that contradicts it. By the time students reach university and might encounter alternative research, they have already internalized the paradigm. Any evidence that contradicts what they learned in childhood seems inherently suspect. The paradigm reproduces itself through education, ensuring each generation accepts the same framework without question. And finally, there are the institutions that explicitly exist to control information. The Vatican archives contain documents spanning 12 centuries, 53 miles of shelving. The Catholic Church has been collecting texts, artifacts, and information for 2,000 years. They have acquired materials from suppressed movements, confiscated documents from conquered peoples, preserved records that secular authorities destroyed. What is in there? We know some of what they hold: ancient texts, church trial records, diplomatic correspondence. But what about the materials from groups the Church eliminated? The Cathars, the Templars, the Gnostics. What knowledge did those groups possess that was dangerous enough to warrant total eradication? And does the Vatican still hold that knowledge in sealed vaults? The fact that access is restricted, that only approved scholars studying approved topics can enter, tells you that information control is still active policy. If the archives contain nothing threatening to current narratives, they would be fully public. The restriction indicates there is something to hide. This is the structure. Academic gatekeeping ensures paradigm-challenging research never gets legitimized. Media framing ensures the public dismisses it as fringe. Funding control ensures it never gets properly investigated. Education ensures each generation accepts the official story. And explicit institutional secrecy ensures certain information never becomes public at all. It is not one massive conspiracy. It is a system. A self-reinforcing structure that suppresses information threatening to established power, established religion, established understanding. And it works because most people participating in it genuinely believe they are defending truth rather than obscuring it. But the system has a weakness. It was designed for a world where information could be controlled at the source. In the digital age, that control is slipping. Independent researchers can publish directly. Evidence can be shared globally. Communities can form around investigating suppressed topics. The structure is still there, still functioning, but it is losing effectiveness. And that means the information our ancestors tried to preserve, the truth about these entities and what they did to humanity, is becoming accessible again. The question is, what happens when enough people learn it? What happens when the collective amnesia finally breaks? What happens when humanity remembers the gods it tried so hard to forget? Let me show you the pattern one more time. But now, with everything we have learned, 12,800 years ago, Earth was struck by fragments of a disintegrating comet. The impacts ignited continental wildfires. The thermal shock melted ice sheets. Flooding destroyed coastal civilizations. Megafauna went extinct. The human population collapsed to perhaps a few million worldwide. This is geological fact. The evidence exists in the younger Dryas boundary layer, in the flood sediments, in the mass extinction data. But here is what conventional science cannot explain. Why did human culture change so radically in the aftermath? Not just rebuilding. Complete transformation. The relationship between humans and the divine was fundamentally altered within a narrow time window following the catastrophe. Sites like Göbekli Tepe, built in the immediate aftermath, show sophisticated construction capability but were then deliberately buried. Religious imagery systematically destroyed. The entities that had been worshipped for thousands of years suddenly became forbidden. This was not natural cultural evolution. This was decision. Collective, coordinated, global decision. And for that to happen, for cultures separated by thousands of miles to make the same choice simultaneously, there had to be communication. There had to be shared understanding. There had to be survivors of the pre-flood civilization who carried knowledge of what had happened and why it must never happen again. Now layer in the ancient texts. Every major culture has the same story. Beings from the sky, genetic manipulation, forbidden knowledge, hybrid offspring, conflict among the gods, catastrophic flood, withdrawal of divine presence. These are not independent myths that coincidentally share themes. These are different cultural accounts of the same historical events. The Sumerian texts are the most explicit. The Anunnaki came to Earth to extract resources. They created or modified humans to serve as labor. Factions developed. Enlil wanted to maintain separation from humanity. Enki favored giving humans knowledge and autonomy. The conflict escalated. Enlil decided humanity had become too numerous and too knowledgeable. When he learned a catastrophe was coming, he forbade warning humans. Enki defied him and told Ziusudra to build a boat and preserve civilization's knowledge. The flood came. Most of humanity died. The Anunnaki withdrew from direct rule, and the survivors made a choice. Never again would they worship these entities. Never again would they allow themselves to be enslaved to beings who viewed human life as disposable. But here is the revelation that changes everything. The entities never left. They adapted. Think about what we have documented. UFO encounters showing technology identical to ancient descriptions of divine vehicles. Abduction experiences involving genetic manipulation identical to ancient accounts of gods breeding with humans. Elite gatherings, performing rituals to ancient deities. Cutting-edge technology explicitly framed as opening portals to other dimensions. Systematic suppression of archaeological evidence that would prove advanced pre-flood civilization. Institutional control of information spanning thousands of years. These are not separate phenomena. This is one continuous operation. The gods our ancestors buried at Göbekli Tepe are the same entities encountered by Commander Fravor off the coast of San Diego. The Watchers who took human wives in the Book of Enoch are the same beings conducting reproductive examinations in modern abduction experiences. The Anunnaki who demanded gold and worship in Sumerian times are still extracting resources and energy from humanity, just through different mechanisms. They learned from the rejection. They learned that overt control provokes rebellion, so they went covert. They cannot rule openly as kings anymore, so they rule through systems, through institutions humans created but no longer fully control, through economic structures that extract human labor and resources just as effectively as ancient slavery, through religious frameworks that channel human worship and energy toward entities that remain hidden behind theological abstraction, through technology that promises liberation but creates new forms of dependency. And here is the truly disturbing part. They have been preparing for something. The abduction experiences consistently report messages about a coming transition, a revelation, a return. The ancient prophecies describe the same thing: the end of an age, the return of the gods, a final conflict, a sorting of humanity. What if both sources are describing the same planned event? What if these entities have been waiting for specific conditions to be met before returning to overt control? What if they have been managing human development, allowing certain technological advancement while suppressing others, steering us toward a moment when they can reveal themselves without triggering the kind of mass rejection that happened 12,000 years ago? Consider the timeline. Human population has exploded. We are approaching 8 billion, a number that would have been unimaginable even 2 centuries ago. Technology has advanced to the point where we have nuclear weapons, genetic engineering, quantum computing, artificial intelligence. We are approaching or have reached several threshold capabilities that match descriptions in ancient texts of what made humanity dangerous before the flood. And at this exact moment in history, UFO encounters are increasing. The Pentagon is acknowledging their existence. Mainstream media is covering it seriously for the first time. The stigma is being systematically removed. Why now? After 70 years of denial and ridicule, why is the narrative suddenly shifting toward acceptance? Because disclosure is not accidental. It is preparation. They are acclimating humanity to the idea that non-human intelligence exists, that it has been interacting with us, that it possesses superior technology. When the full revelation comes, when these entities show themselves openly, it will not be complete shock. We will have been conditioned to accept it. But here is what they are not preparing us for: the truth about what they did to us, the truth about why our ancestors rejected them, the truth about the exploitation, the manipulation, the catastrophe they allowed or caused. That history has been erased. Most of humanity has no memory of why we stopped worshipping these gods, which means when they return, when they present themselves as saviors or teachers or benevolent guides, most people will accept them. Most people will not know to reject them. The ancient knowledge that our ancestors tried so hard to preserve through the erasure, the warning encoded in the deliberate burial of Göbekli Tepe, will be lost on a humanity that has forgotten why those temples were sealed. Unless enough people remember, unless enough people understand what the evidence is actually showing, unless the collective amnesia breaks before the return occurs. And that is why this information is so critical. That is why the suppression structure exists. That is why archaeological evidence gets buried, why researchers get marginalized, why ancient texts get dismissed as mythology. Because if humanity remembers, if we understand what these entities are and what they have done, we can reject them again. We can refuse to return to the relationship our ancestors died to escape. This is not about believing in ancient aliens or conspiracy theories. This is about recognizing patterns in physical evidence. Archaeological sites deliberately buried, global flood myths describing the same event, ancient texts describing genetic manipulation and catastrophe, modern encounters showing identical patterns, systematic suppression of information that connects it all. The evidence has always been there, in the stones, in the texts, in the continued encounters. What has been missing is the willingness to see it as one coherent story, rather than disconnected anomalies. Our ancestors buried their gods because those gods failed them. They erased the evidence because they did not want future generations to be tempted into the same servitude. They created new religious frameworks emphasizing human autonomy and connection to an unknowable, distant divine source, specifically to prevent humanity from worshipping entities that could be manipulated or that would manipulate us. For 12,000 years, that erasure worked. We forgot. We became vulnerable again. And now, as we approach the conditions that preceded the last catastrophe, as these entities prepare to reveal themselves, we face the same choice our ancestors faced. Do we worship them? Do we serve them? Do we accept their offer of knowledge and technology in exchange for submission? Or do we remember what they are? Do we recognize the pattern? Do we choose human sovereignty over divine tyranny? The revelation is not that gods exist. The revelation is that our ancestors already dealt with them, already made the hard choice, and left us the evidence we would need to make the same choice when the time came. That time is now. The gods are returning. And everything depends on whether we remember why they were erased in the first place. So here we are. You have seen the evidence. You understand the pattern. You know what our ancestors tried to tell us through the buried temples, the defaced statues, the transformed myths. The question that matters now is simple. What do you do with this information? I am not going to tell you to believe everything I have presented. That would make you exactly the kind of follower these entities want, someone who accepts authority without verification. Instead, I am going to tell you to investigate, to verify, to think for yourself, because that is precisely what they do not want you to do. Start with the archaeology. You can visit Göbekli Tepe. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site in Turkey, open to tourists. You can see the massive T-shaped pillars with your own eyes. You can observe the precision of the carving, the sophistication of the layout, the evidence of deliberate burial. You do not have to take my word for it. The site exists. The evidence is physical and verifiable. Look into the younger Dryas impact hypothesis. This is not fringe science anymore. Research teams from multiple institutions have published peer-reviewed papers documenting the evidence. The platinum spike, the nanodiamonds, the carbon spherules, the sudden climate reversal, the mass extinction. You can read the actual scientific literature. Start with the work of Richard Firestone, Alan West, and James Kennett. Their 2023 paper in the journal Airbursts and Cratering Impacts provides comprehensive evidence that something catastrophic struck Earth 12,800 years ago. Read the ancient texts yourself, not summaries, not interpretations, the actual source material. The Book of Enoch is available online in multiple translations. The Sumerian tablets have been translated and published. The Mahabharata exists in English. The Egyptian pyramid texts are accessible. Read them with the understanding that these might be historical accounts recorded in mythological language. See if the patterns I have described hold up under your own examination. Follow independent researchers who are doing the work mainstream institutions refuse to do. Graham Hancock has spent 30 years documenting evidence of advanced pre-Ice Age civilization. His books are extensively researched and footnoted. You may not agree with all his conclusions, but you cannot dismiss the evidence he presents. Randall Carlson has done extraordinary work on the geological evidence of the Younger Dryas catastrophe. Robert Schoch continues to publish research on the true age of ancient monuments. These people have sacrificed conventional academic careers to pursue truth. Their work deserves serious consideration. Investigate the UFO phenomenon with the same skeptical rigor you would apply to any other topic. The Pentagon UAP reports are public documents. The Navy pilot testimonies are on record. The radar data exists. This is not about believing wild claims. This is about examining evidence that military and government sources are now confirming. Ask yourself why the narrative is suddenly shifting after 70 years of denial. Ask yourself what is being prepared for. But most importantly, understand that verification is not the same as acceptance. You can acknowledge that Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried without accepting my interpretation of why. You can recognize that UFOs demonstrate capabilities beyond our current technology without agreeing they are the ancient gods returning. The point is not to believe what I am telling you. The point is to think critically about what you have been told by institutional authorities and to recognize when evidence contradicts the approved narrative. Because here is what I know for certain. The suppression structure exists. Academic gatekeeping is real. Funding controls what gets researched. Media frames what the public thinks. Education indoctrinates rather than educates. And institutional secrecy keeps certain information perpetually hidden. These are verifiable facts regardless of whether you accept the deeper implications. And once you see the suppression structure, once you understand how it functions, you start to ask the critical question, why? Why suppress evidence of advanced ancient civilization? Why ridicule UFO research for decades? Why restrict access to archaeological sites? Why keep vast archives of historical documents classified or restricted? What is being protected by keeping these things hidden? The conventional answer is that institutions are protecting scientific rigor or national security or cultural heritage. But when you see the consistency of what gets suppressed, when you see the pattern of what knowledge is kept from public access, you start to suspect there is a more fundamental reason. Someone benefits from humanity remaining ignorant of its true history. Someone benefits from us not knowing about these entities and what they did. Someone benefits from the collective amnesia continuing. Now, I cannot tell you definitively who that someone is. It might be the entities themselves, operating through human institutions they have infiltrated or influenced over millennia. It might be human elites who possess knowledge the rest of us lack and use that knowledge to maintain power. It might be both, a collaboration between non-human intelligence and human collaborators. Or it might be something else entirely that I have not considered. What I can tell you is that the erasure our ancestors attempted 12,000 years ago is being actively maintained in the modern world. The methods have evolved, but the function remains the same. Prevent humanity from remembering what happened and why we rejected these gods. And that brings us to the final question. What happens next? The prophecies, both ancient and modern, describe a return, a revelation, a moment when what has been hidden becomes visible. Every major religious tradition has some version of this: the second coming, the return of the Mahdi, the arrival of the Messiah, the descent of the Kalki avatar, the return of Quetzalcoatl. Different names, same basic concept. Divine or supernatural entities returning to Earth in a moment of crisis or transition. What if these prophecies are not metaphysical prediction but operational timeline? What if these entities have always intended to return once certain conditions were met? What if they have been managing human development, steering us toward a moment when they could reveal themselves and resume overt control? If that is the case, then we are approaching that moment. The technological thresholds are being reached. The population numbers are there. The environmental and social conditions are deteriorating in ways that might make humanity desperate enough to accept external intervention. The narrative is being shifted to prepare people for the reality of non-human intelligence. All the pieces are moving into position. But here is the thing about prophecy. It only comes true if people fulfill it. If humanity collectively decides to reject these entities, to choose sovereignty over submission, to remember why our ancestors buried their gods, then the predicted return does not have to go the way they planned. That requires enough people knowing the truth, enough people understanding the pattern, enough people choosing to investigate rather than accept, to think rather than believe, to remember rather than forget. And that is why I create this content. Not to tell you what to think, but to show you evidence that has been suppressed and to encourage you to investigate it yourself, because every person who wakes up to the pattern, who understands the history, who recognizes what is being prepared for, is one more person who cannot be easily manipulated when the revelation comes. Our ancestors gave us a warning. They buried it in stone. They encoded it in myth. They transformed their gods into demons, so we would know to reject them. They did everything they could with the tools they had to make sure future generations would not repeat their mistakes. Now it is our responsibility to understand that warning, to preserve it, to share it, and when the time comes, to make the same choice they made: human freedom over divine slavery, sovereignty over submission, truth over comfortable lies. The gods are returning. The question is whether we will remember why they left. If you found this information valuable, subscribe to this channel, share this video, start your own investigation, talk to people, question everything you have been taught about human history, and most importantly, do not let this knowledge die with you. Our ancestors tried to preserve it for 12,000 years. Now it is our turn to carry it forward. Because the ultimate revelation is not that gods exist or that they are coming back. The ultimate revelation is that humanity has always had the power to reject them. We did it before. We can do it again. But only if we remember. The choice, as always, is yours. I have shown you the evidence. What you do with it determines what happens next. Not just for you, but for all of us. Because this is not individual awakening. This is collective memory returning. And when enough of us remember, everything changes. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and never stop questioning. This is Mr. H. Thank you for watching.